The sun blazed over Greenville's suburban sprawl, bouncing off SUV hoods and storefront windows like flares off polished chrome. Inside a packed strip mall, Saturday shoppers hustled in and out of air-conditioned stores, carts creaking, heels clacking, and the scent of cinnamon pretzels bleeding into the heavy southern air. At 9:56 a.m. sharp, a man pulled into the farthest parking spot, deliberately. No valet, no reserved CEO signage, just a dusty Ford Explorer idling like it didn't belong. Out stepped Malcolm Rivers, 44, tall, broad-shouldered, dressed down in faded jeans, a worn grey hoodie, and a Carolina Panthers cap tugged low over his brow. No briefcase, no entourage, and absolutely no indication that he was the founder and CEO of EverNorth Goods, a nationwide retail powerhouse that had turned his name into a boardroom brand. But this morning wasn't about strategy decks or shareholder calls, it was about the rumors. Those whispers of cold service, quiet bias, and smiling discrimination that had finally made their way to his desk. So Malcolm came not as a boss, but as a stranger. To walk the aisles of his own store. To see, with unfiltered eyes, if the empire he built on values still held those values upright. He wasn't prepared for what he was about to find. And what started with silence at the electronics counter would soon unravel into a confrontation that shook the very core of his company. Because sometimes the ugliest truths hide in the brightest spaces, and sometimes the only way to fix a broken system is to walk into it like a customer and feel it break you. And with that, Malcolm took a breath, opened the door, and stepped into his own creation. Unseen, unrecognized, and completely unprotected. The doors whispered open with a hiss of pressurized air as Malcolm Rivers stepped inside EverNorth Goods, store number 206, his store. But no one looked up. The chill of the air conditioning hit him like a wall, crisp and clinical, a sharp contrast to the late-morning Carolina heat that still clung to his hoodie. Around him, shopping carts clattered, children argued over toys, and pop music trickled down from invisible ceiling speakers. It was just another Saturday to everyone else. But for Malcolm, it was a silent battlefield. He moved slowly, deliberately, down the wide main aisle, every step echoing like it belonged to someone else. The polished concrete beneath his boots reflected the overhead LEDs in cold, sterile blinks. To the casual observer, he was just a tired man out to buy something ordinary. Maybe headphones, maybe a blender. No one saw the storm behind his eyes. He paused near a rack of wireless speakers stacked like colorful bricks. His hand hovered over one of the boxes, fingers brushing the glossy packaging. But he wasn't reading specs. He was watching, listening. Across the aisle, a teenage employee in EverNorth's striped navy vest leaned against the tech counter, glued to his phone, fingers tapping furiously. No greeting, no glance, not even a flicker of acknowledgement. Malcolm shifted the weight on his feet, letting the box hit the countertop. Not hard, but loud enough to be heard. Still nothing. The tension in his shoulders climbed inch by inch, like a spring winding too tight. This wasn't just a missed hello. This was a litmus test. He looked around. Near the kitchenware display, a white couple received cheerful help from another staff member. Smiles, gestures, full engagement. Further down, an older woman laughed with an associate near the throw pillows. Everyone else was getting warmth. Malcolm got frostbite. He turned back to the counter. The kid finally looked up, eyes dulled with boredom. Need something? Malcolm smiled faintly, masking the sting. Yeah, wondering if these are good for outdoor use. The kid shrugged. Probably, it says on the box. Silence. Something heavy settled in Malcolm's chest. Not anger, not yet. Disappointment, the kind that weighed more because it was personal. Because this was his space, his brand, his legacy. And at this very moment, it was failing someone who looked just like him. He exhaled slow and steady, then moved on, like any other forgotten customer, blending back into a store he once believed stood for something more. But this wasn't the end. It was the beginning of a reckoning. Malcolm drifted through the aisles like smoke, silent, steady, watching everything. The smell of fresh plastic and floor wax clung to the air. Overhead, lights buzzed faintly, flickering in perfect rhythm with the corporate playlist humming down from the speakers. He passed rows of neatly arranged products, smart home gadgets, portable chargers, stacks of LED bulbs, each one a reminder of how far EverNorth had come since its garage-born beginnings. But right now, none of it felt like his. He wasn't here to admire what he'd built. He was here to challenge it. In his hand, he held a boxed set of Bluetooth speakers. Not expensive, not cheap. The kind of product that typically invited interaction. Questions, comparisons, maybe a suggestion for a better model. The kind of moment EverNorth's brand prided itself on. Connection over commission. He approached the electronics counter again, same kid, same phone, same posture. Slouched, lazy, eyes flicking up with reluctant disinterest as Malcolm placed the box down gently on the counter. "Can I help you?" the boy muttered, already halfway back to his screen. Malcolm nodded. "I was wondering, are these weatherproof? I'm looking for something I can use on the patio." The kid, Kyle, his name tag barely hanging on, sighed like Malcolm had just asked him to solve an equation. He flipped the box over with a single finger, didn't read, just skimmed. "Yeah, I guess. It says outdoor compatible," he mumbled, then shoved the box back like it was contaminated. Malcolm stood there, letting the silence stretch, long enough to make it awkward. "And what about device compatibility? Is it universal, or do you need a specific app?" Kyle rolled his eyes. "Dude, it's Bluetooth. It connects to stuff. It's not rocket science." There it was. The line, the smirk. The edge of disdain that jabbed deeper than any raised voice could. A quiet, casual disrespect wrapped in apathy. Dismissive, detached, dangerous. Malcolm blinked, steadying himself. "All right, thanks for your time." Kyle was already scrolling again before the last word left Malcolm's lips. As Malcolm turned away, gripping the box tighter than necessary, he could feel the churn starting in his gut. He wasn't expecting fanfare. He didn't want special treatment. But this wasn't a lack of energy. It was a lack of decency. And it made him wonder how many people had walked into this very store, felt that same cold front, and walked out convinced they didn't matter. He placed the box back on the shelf. No drama, no confrontation, just quiet, calculated resolve. This moment, this seemingly insignificant interaction, wasn't a fluke. It was a mirror. And what he saw staring back at him wasn't just about Kyle. It was about what the culture had silently become. And Malcolm knew one thing for sure. If indifference had become acceptable, then everything he thought he stood for was in danger. Malcolm wandered deeper into the store, his breath measured, footsteps silent against the smooth concrete floor. He needed a moment to reset, to stop the heat in his chest from turning into something sharp. The home goods section was quieter, softer. Rows of throw pillows, dish sets, and scented candles created a false sense of calm. He pretended to browse a display of cast-iron cookware, running his fingers across the matte black handles. But his ears were on high alert. And that's when it happened. Two employees stood just down the aisle, partially hidden behind a seasonal end cap filled with fake plants and patio lanterns. They spoke in hushed tones, casual and unbothered, completely unaware that the man they were talking about was 10 feet away. "That guy in the hoodie," one of them muttered. His name tag read Brent. He was tall, early 20s, with an air of smugness that came not from confidence, but from never being held accountable. Brent jerked his chin subtly in Malcolm's direction. "Bet he's just here to loiter. People like that never buy anything big." The other employee snorted. "Right? I saw him at the electronics counter earlier. Looked like he didn't even know what Bluetooth was. Probably just killing time till his ride shows up." They chuckled, a low, shared laugh, like it was nothing, like he was nothing. Malcolm didn't move, didn't flinch. His fingers tightened slightly around the edge of the skillet, the cool iron anchoring him. He'd heard worse in his life, far worse, but something about this, the ease of it, the normalization of it inside his store, was like being gutted slowly with a dull blade. They weren't angry. They weren't trying to be cruel. This was just how they talked. Assumption as reflex, disrespect as background noise. And if they spoke like this about him, the founder of the entire company, how did they speak about single mothers trying to stretch a budget? Or elderly customers asking questions they couldn't Google? How many people walked out of these doors carrying invisible wounds? He exhaled slowly, forced his hand to release the pan, and stepped away from the shelf. His heart beat harder than it should have. Not from rage, but from recognition. This wasn't about two bad apples. This was about rot taking root, silently, beneath the surface. Malcolm moved on, keeping his back to them. He didn't want them to know who he was. Not yet. Let them keep talking. Let them stay comfortable. Because the truth was, they weren't just mocking a stranger in a hoodie. They were mocking the values that built their paychecks. And Malcolm wasn't going to let it go unanswered. Not now, not ever. Malcolm needed air, not the kind you breathe, but the kind that clears your head. He rounded a corner into the front end of the store, where the checkout lanes buzzed with activity. The overhead lights felt harsher here, less forgiving. He scanned the faces behind the registers, looking not for a problem, but for something real. And then he saw her. Charlene, early 50s, stood at lane 3. Her posture was proud, her hair pulled into a neat bun, and her EverNorth name tag was polished like it meant something. There was a grace to the way she moved, even in the chaos, scanning items, chatting softly with customers, making eye contact, smiling like she meant it. Malcolm stepped into her line. Ahead of him, an elderly man with a cane fumbled through a wallet full of coupons. Charlene didn't rush him. She waited patiently, gently helping him organize the slips, ringing each one with care. "You saved $12.84 today, Mr. Riley," she said warmly, handing him the receipt like a gift. "Now go treat yourself to that peach cobbler you like." The old man chuckled. "You remembered." "I always do," she winked. Malcolm felt something stir in his chest. It wasn't nostalgia, it was a reminder. This was the culture he'd envisioned. Not perfection, not polish. Humanity. When it was his turn, Charlene greeted him the same way she'd greeted the man before. "Good morning, sir. Did you find everything okay?" Malcolm hesitated. "Not exactly, but I found what I needed." Charlene gave him a curious glance but didn't press. "Well, if there's anything I can help you with, anything at all, you just say the word." He smiled. For the first time that day, it wasn't forced. "You already have." The scanner beeped, the bag crinkled. Behind him, another customer sighed impatiently. But for a moment, Malcolm stood still, soaking in the simple truth. Not everything was broken. There were still good people on the floor. People who carried the weight of the brand with pride. People who didn't need a title to lead. Charlene didn't know she'd just anchored him. She didn't know her kindness was about to shift the tone of a corporate reckoning. She was just doing her job, with dignity, with heart, with quiet excellence. And Malcolm realized fixing his company wasn't just about rooting out what was wrong. It was about protecting what was right. As he stepped out of her line, a new kind of resolve settled in his bones. The next move wouldn't be reactive, it would be deliberate. And when he returned to this store, he wouldn't be wearing a hoodie. He'd be wearing the truth, and truth had no uniform. Malcolm sat behind the wheel of his Ford Explorer, the engine idling low beneath the soft hum of the air conditioning. The afternoon sun bore down on the windshield, casting streaks of light across the dashboard, but he didn't move. His fingers rested on the steering wheel, tight, unmoving. His reflection in the rearview mirror didn't look like a CEO. It looked like a man carrying the weight of betrayal, his store, his vision. And yet, the warmth he'd fought to build had chilled into apathy. He pulled out his notebook from the glove compartment, well worn, the leather soft with use. On the inside cover, a quote he wrote years ago stared back at him. "Every customer is family, even when we don't know their name." He exhaled hard, then opened a blank page and began scribbling observations. Indifference at the electronics counter. Racial assumptions from floor staff. Inconsistent service tone. Charlene, a rare exception. The pen scratched faster now, lines underlined, words circled. This wasn't just a list, it was a pulse check, and the results weren't good. Malcolm closed the notebook slowly and reached for his phone. He tapped a contact labeled Jake Benson, store manager number 206, and let it ring. "Jake speaking," came the voice on the other end, professional if a little distracted. "Jake, it's Malcolm Rivers." A pause. "Mr. Rivers? Oh, wow. Good afternoon, sir. I didn't expect... I'm in your parking lot." Another pause, longer, thicker. "I'd like to come inside," Malcolm continued calmly, "and have a conversation, not as a customer, as your CEO." "Of course, sir. I'll be right out." "No need," Malcolm said. "I know the way." He ended the call, stepped out of the car, and walked toward the store's automatic doors again. But this time, his gait had changed. Gone was the cautious pace of anonymity. In its place was something firmer, measured, unflinching. Inside, the atmosphere hadn't changed. Same music, same fluorescent lights, same staff. But everything was different now. Jake met him at the customer service desk within minutes, his smile tight, nerves radiating through his posture. "Mr. Rivers," he said, extending a hand. Malcolm shook it firmly. "Let's talk." They moved to the break room, a sterile space with vending machines and beige walls that didn't care who you were. Jake gestured for Malcolm to sit. He didn't. He stayed standing. "I was in this store today," Malcolm began, "and what I saw, what I heard, left me deeply concerned." He recounted the indifference, the overheard comments, the contrast between employees. Jake's face shifted from red to pale, his mouth opening then closing, unsure where to land. "This isn't about blaming you," Malcolm said, his voice low but razor-sharp. "This is about accountability, from the top down, starting with me." Jake nodded slowly. "What would you like me to do?" Malcolm looked him in the eye. "Gather your staff, now." Because this wasn't just a check-in, it was the beginning of a reckoning. The break room filled slowly, one uniformed employee after another filing in with confused expressions and nervous whispers. Some carried half-eaten snacks, others held phones mid-scroll. No one quite understood why the store manager had summoned everyone on such short notice. It wasn't time for a shift change, there was no system outage. But when Malcolm Rivers stepped forward, no longer in a hoodie, no longer hiding, everything stopped. The silence wasn't just quiet, it was still. A weighted hush fell over the room like a dropped curtain. Some recognized him immediately, others needed a beat. But the second his voice cut through the air, no one could look away. "Good afternoon," he began, voice calm, clear, and unwavering. "For those of you who don't know me, my name is Malcolm Rivers. I'm the founder and CEO of EverNorth Goods." A few jaws dropped, eyes widened. Kyle, the electronics associate, visibly tensed, his arms slowly lowering from a crossed position. "I visited this store today," Malcolm continued, "not as your CEO, not in a suit, but as a regular customer, no name badge, no warning. Just a man walking in, looking to see if the heart of this company still beats the way it used to." He paused, letting the words sink in. "And what I experienced," he took a breath, "was a mix of pride and heartbreak." He turned his gaze toward Charlene, who stood near the back. "Some of you, like Charlene, reminded me why this company was worth building in the first place. You served with grace, with humanity. You made people feel seen." Charlene's lips parted slightly, her eyes glistening, but she didn't speak. She just nodded, humbled. "But others," Malcolm said, turning slowly toward Kyle, "looked right through me, treated me like I didn't matter, made assumptions based on appearance, or worse, said things behind my back that had nothing to do with service and everything to do with ignorance." Kyle froze, eyes locked on the floor. Brent shifted uncomfortably beside him. "This isn't about humiliation," Malcolm said, softer now. "It's about responsibility." His voice gathered weight again, like thunder rolling in the distance. "We don't succeed because of our logo or pricing. We succeed because people trust us to treat them with dignity, no matter who they are, what they wear, or where they come from." He looked around the room, eye to eye, face to face. "And if even one customer leaves feeling unseen, disrespected, or unwelcome, then we have failed. I have failed." A long silence followed, not defensive, reflective. "I'm not here to fire anyone today," he said finally, "but I am here to make something clear. The culture we tolerate is the culture we become. And as of this moment, the culture at this store changes." He stepped back slightly. "This isn't a warning, it's a wake-up call." And for the first time all day, everyone in the room finally heard him. Malcolm let the silence linger. It wasn't awkward, it was intentional. A silence meant to create space, for the weight of his words to settle, for the reality of what had just unfolded to breathe. Then he stepped forward again, his tone shifting, less heavy now, but no less firm. "Here's what's going to happen next," he said, "because words without action are just noise." All eyes were locked on him. Even the employees who had crossed their arms earlier had let them fall to their sides. No one dared check their phones. No one even blinked. "First," Malcolm began, "starting this month, EverNorth Goods will implement mandatory training on unconscious bias and respectful customer service, not just here, but across every single store in the country." A murmur ran through the room, not of resistance, but of realization. We can't assume people just know how to treat others. We have to teach it, reinforce it, and yes, hold people accountable when they fail to meet that standard. He turned to Jake, the store manager, who stood tall despite the pressure, his expression a mix of shame and commitment. "Jake, you'll be the first store to pilot the program. You'll work directly with HR and our learning team starting Monday. You good with that?" Jake nodded. "Yes, sir, absolutely." "Second," Malcolm continued, "I'll be doing more unannounced visits. Not just to check up, but to reconnect. I need to see, hear, and feel what's really happening on the ground, because culture is built by proximity, not by policies." The employees looked at each other, some visibly surprised, others nodding. A few even looked relieved. "Third, and this one matters just as much as the rest, we're establishing a company-wide anonymous reporting system. If you see bias, mistreatment, or leadership failure, you'll have a way to say something without fear of retaliation." Charlene smiled faintly from the back of the room. Kyle's shoulders sank. Brent looked at the floor. Malcolm's tone softened then, like the final chord of a symphony. "I started this company because I believed we could do better, be better than the world I grew up in. Not just sell things, but build something that made people feel respected." He glanced around once more, his voice steady, unapologetic. "We lost our way. Not entirely, but enough to matter. And we don't fix that by pointing fingers. We fix it by showing up, together." There was no applause, that wasn't the point. But there was a shift, a crack in the air, the kind that happens when people feel change, not just hear it. As Malcolm stepped aside, giving the room back to its people, he knew this wasn't a performance. It was a pivot, a turn away from tolerance of indifference and toward accountability with heart. Because real leadership doesn't just correct mistakes, it builds new standards. The meeting broke, but the energy in the room didn't dissipate. It hummed, low and electric. Employees shuffled out quietly, their faces a mix of reflection, shame, and renewed purpose. No one laughed, no one rolled their eyes. Something had shifted, and they knew it. Malcolm remained behind, arms crossed, eyes tracing the edges of the break room's ceiling tiles. He wasn't thinking about profit margins or brand expansion. He was thinking about rot, the kind that starts small, barely noticeable, but spreads silently through the foundation if left unchecked. Jake approached him again, hands in his pockets. "I didn't know, sir. I really didn't." Malcolm gave him a measured look. "I believe you. But leadership isn't about knowing everything. It's about noticing the things you didn't know and doing something about it." Jake nodded slowly. "We'll do better. Hold your team accountable, not just for performance, for how they treat people." Malcolm glanced toward the door. "Because when that goes, everything else does too." As Malcolm exited the break room, he made one final stop before the doors. Charlene was back at her register, scanning items with the same warmth she'd shown all morning. He stepped into her line, not to test her, not to observe, but to thank her. When she looked up, she froze. Recognition flickered behind her eyes. "Mr. Rivers." He smiled. "Thank you, Charlene, not just for what you did for me, but for what you do for this company, every single day." She looked humbled, her hands pausing mid-scan. "I just try to treat people the way I'd want someone to treat my son. That's the culture I started this company to build," he said quietly. "And today, you reminded me it still exists. You're the reason it's worth saving." Her eyes glistened, but she held her composure. "Thank you, sir." Malcolm left the store without fanfare. No press, no announcement, no cameras. Just a man walking back to his car, changed. As he settled into the driver's seat, the sun now slanting low across the horizon, he finally allowed himself to breathe. Deep, intentional. What happened today wasn't just about a store or a bad employee, it was about culture, and the hard truth that you can't lead a company from the top unless you're willing to walk its floor. He glanced at his notebook on the passenger seat. Pages filled with pain, hope, and opportunity. This wasn't a one-day fix, it was the beginning of a new blueprint. Because companies don't change through slogans, they change when someone at the top dares to look in the mirror and doesn't look away. And Malcolm Rivers had seen enough to know he wasn't going to. Not now, not ever again. Bias doesn't always come with shouting. It doesn't always wear a white hood or hold a protest sign or slam doors in people's faces. Sometimes, more often than we like to admit, it comes wrapped in a smile, buried beneath polite indifference, and justified with the most dangerous phrase in the English language. It's not that serious. But here's the truth. What feels small to one person can be the moment that shatters another. When Malcolm Rivers walked into his own store, no one shouted at him, no one told him he didn't belong. Instead, they looked through him, dismissed him, laughed at him behind his back. Because of his hoodie, his skin, the assumption that he wasn't someone worth helping. And that's what makes this kind of bias so insidious. It hides behind routines. It thrives in unchecked spaces. It tells itself, I'm not racist. I'm just tired. I'm just busy. I didn't mean anything by it. But bias doesn't require malice. It only requires comfort and the belief that no one will ever hold you accountable. That's why leadership matters. Because Malcolm didn't just witness a bad interaction. He uncovered a silent fracture in the culture he'd spent years trying to build. And rather than bury it, rather than dismiss it as just one bad day, he did something harder. He faced it. Not with rage, not with revenge, but with honesty, with structure, with action. He looked in the mirror and asked, what have I allowed to grow while I wasn't watching? And in doing so, he gave his company a second chance, not just to serve better, but to be better. That's the lesson here. Whether you're a CEO, a cashier, a teacher, or a student, we are all responsible for the spaces we shape. We are all either protecting dignity or eroding it. And the difference between a thriving culture and a toxic one isn't always policy. It's the tiny, daily choices made when no one's watching. So the next time you feel tempted to ignore the quiet disrespect happening in front of you, the next time you catch yourself making assumptions based on appearance, the next time someone tells you it's not a big deal, remember this story. Because it wasn't a headline that changed this company. It wasn't a lawsuit. It was one man walking into his own store, invisible, and realizing the hardest truth of all, that sometimes the most dangerous problems are the ones that wear a smile and blend in. And real change, it starts the moment someone dares to see the invisible and refuses to look away.